Have you ever experienced a camping trip that turned into a nightmare? Imagine your best friend suddenly acting strangely, disappearing friends, and an ancient curse lurking in the woods. In this video, I'll share the terrifying true story of our week-long camping trip that turned into a desperate fight for survival against a sinister force. What would you do if the person you trusted most became your worst nightmare? How would you react when cryptic warnings and eerie events unfold around you? Stay with me as I recount every spine-chilling detail of the night we confronted an unimaginable evil, and the desperate escape that followed. If you love real-life horror stories and the paranormal, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe to my channel. Don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss another terrifying tale. Let's dive into this eerie experience together. Jeremy and I had been best friends for as long as I could remember. We met in kindergarten and had been inseparable ever since. Whether it was playing video games, exploring the woods behind our houses, or just hanging out, we did everything together. Jeremy was like a brother to me, and I couldn't imagine my life without him. One summer, when we were both 16, Jeremy invited me on a week-long camping trip with his grandparents. It was going to be an adventure, a break from the usual routine. Jeremy's girlfriend, Emily, and two of our other friends, Mark and Lisa, were coming too. The more the merrier, we thought. Jeremy's grandparents had organized everything, and they had always been cool with us, treating us like their own grandkids. The day finally came, and we piled into Jeremy's grandparents' old RV, filled with excitement and anticipation. The campsite was in a remote area, surrounded by dense woods and a clear, sparkling lake. It was the perfect spot for a week of fun and relaxation. We talked and laughed the entire drive, making plans for hiking, swimming, and nightly campfires. When we arrived, the place was even more beautiful than we had imagined. The air was fresh, and the sounds of nature were all around us. We quickly set up our tents and gathered firewood for the evening. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the lake, and everything felt perfect. That first night, we sat around the campfire, roasting marshmallows and telling stories. Jeremy's grandparents shared tales of their own camping adventures from years ago, and we all laughed and enjoyed the night. It was exactly what we had hoped for, a chance to bond and create new memories. As the days went by, we settled into a comfortable routine. We spent our mornings hiking the trails, afternoons swimming in the lake, and evenings sitting by the campfire. Jeremy's grandparents made sure we were well fed, cooking delicious meals over the fire. It was a simple, happy time, and we all felt at ease. But things started to change as the week went on. It was subtle at first, little things that didn't seem important. Jeremy began to act a bit strange. He would zone out during conversations, staring off into the distance with a vacant look in his eyes. We joked about him being tired or distracted by Emily, but there was something unsettling about it. One night, after we had all gone to bed, I woke up to see Jeremy getting up and leaving the tent. I thought he was just going to the bathroom, but something about the way he moved made me uneasy. I called out to him, but he didn't respond. I decided to follow him, feeling a strange sense of worry. As I stepped outside, I saw Jeremy standing a few meters away, facing the woods. Jeremy, what are you doing?" I called out, but he didn't turn around. I walked closer, my heart pounding for reasons I couldn't explain. When he finally turned to face me, I felt a chill run down my spine. Jeremy's head turned in an unnatural way, and he had a creepy wide smile on his face. It didn't look like him at all. The smile seemed to stretch too far, and his eyes were cold and empty. I tried to laugh it off, thinking it was some kind of joke. "This isn't funny, Jeremy," I said nervously. But then he spoke, and his voice was deep and unsettling, nothing like his usual tone. So the grandparents didn't tell you," he said, stepping closer. My heart raced as he got closer, his smile growing even wider. Before I could react, he lunged at me and lifted me off the ground. It felt like a nightmare, but it was all too real. I struggled and yelled, but his grip was too strong. I was terrified, unsure of what was happening. The camping trip that had started with so much excitement and normalcy was turning into something out of a horror story. And as the days went on, things only got worse. That first night at the campsite was magical. After setting up our tents and gathering around the campfire, we roasted marshmallows and told stories. Jeremy's grandparents shared some funny tales from their own youth, and we all laughed until our sides hurt. The sky was clear, and the stars were brighter than I had ever seen. It was the perfect start to our camping adventure. As the night went on, we started to wind down. Emily and Lisa were talking about the hike we planned for the next day, and Mark was trying to start a game of charades. Jeremy, though, seemed distant. He sat quietly, staring into the fire with a strange expression on his face. I nudged him and asked if he was okay. He smiled briefly and said he was just tired, but something about his smile seemed off. We all decided to call it a night and headed to our tents. Jeremy and I were sharing a tent, just like when we were kids. We got into our sleeping bags and chatted for a bit about the day. I tried to ignore the uneasy feeling I had about Jeremy's behavior. Eventually, we both drifted off to sleep. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. The tent was quiet, except for the sound of crickets outside. I turned over and noticed that Jeremy's sleeping bag was empty. I sat up, rubbing my eyes, and saw the tent flap slightly open. Jeremy must have gone to the bathroom, I thought. After a few minutes, I started to feel uneasy again. Jeremy had been acting strange all evening, and now he was wandering around in the middle of the night. I decided to check on him. I crawled out of my sleeping bag and stepped outside. The cool night air hit me, and I shivered. I looked around and saw Jeremy standing a few meters away, near the edge of the woods. Jeremy, what are you doing?" I called out softly, not wanting to wake the others. He didn't respond. I took a few steps closer, my heart beginning to race. "Hey, Jeremy." I called again, louder this time. He turned slowly to face me, and that's when I felt a chill run down my spine. Jeremy's head turned in an unnatural way, and he had a creepy wide smile on his face. It didn't look like him at all. The smile seemed to stretch too far, and his eyes were cold and empty. My unease turned to fear. I tried to laugh it off, thinking it was some kind of joke. This isn't funny, Jeremy," I said nervously. But then he spoke, and his voice was deep and unsettling, nothing like his usual tone. So the grandparents didn't tell you," he said, stepping closer. My heart raced as he got closer, his smile growing even wider. Jeremy, stop it," I said, backing away. But he kept coming. Before I could react, he lunged at me and lifted me off the ground. It felt like a nightmare, but it was all too real. I struggled and yelled, but his grip was too strong. I was terrified, unsure of what was happening. His strength was inhuman, and his eyes bore into mine with a look of pure malice. Jeremy, let go." I screamed, my voice echoing through the campsite. I kicked and thrashed, but it was no use. The fear I felt was unlike anything I had ever experienced. It was as if my best friend had turned into a monster. Finally, with a sudden jerk, he dropped me to the ground. I scrambled to my feet, gasping for breath. Jeremy stood there, his face still twisted into that horrifying smile. I backed away slowly, not taking my eyes off him. What's wrong with you?" I whispered, but he didn't answer. He just stood there, staring at me with those cold, empty eyes. I ran back to the tent, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what to do. The friend I had known all my life was acting like a stranger, and I was terrified. The rest of the night, I lay in my sleeping bag, wide awake and trembling, wondering what had happened to Jeremy and what was going to happen next. Jeremy stood there, just a few meters away from me, near the edge of the woods. The moonlight cast eerie shadows on his face, making his expression even more unsettling. When he finally turned to face me, it was as if his head moved in slow motion, twisting in an unnatural way that sent chills down my spine. And then I saw it, his smile. It stretched too wide, almost inhumanly so, and his eyes were vacant, devoid of the warmth I knew so well. At first, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe he was playing a prank, trying to scare me. Jeremy, what are you doing?" I called out, my voice trembling slightly. He didn't answer right away, just kept that unsettling smile fixed on me. I took a hesitant step forward, hoping to snap him out of whatever weird mood he was in. But then he spoke, and his voice was different. It was deeper, more resonant, and it didn't sound like him at all. So the grandparents didn't tell you," he said, the words dripping with a sinister edge. My heart started to race, and a wave of fear washed over me. This didn't feel like a joke anymore. I tried to laugh, to shake off the growing dread. "Seriously, Jeremy, this isn't funny," I said, forcing a smile. But the smile on his face only grew wider, and he took a step closer. My pulse quickened, and I felt a knot of fear tighten in my stomach. Something was very wrong. "Jeremy, stop it," I said, my voice rising with panic. But he ignored me, continuing to approach with that same eerie smile. When he was just a foot away, he suddenly lunged and grabbed me by the shoulders, lifting me off the ground with surprising strength. I gasped, my feet dangling in the air, and struggled to free myself. His grip was like iron, and I could feel his fingers digging into my skin. "Jeremy, let go!" I screamed, kicking and writhing in his grasp. But his expression didn't change. His eyes were still cold and empty, and his smile remained fixed in place. It was as if he didn't even hear me. The fear was overwhelming. My best friend, the person I trusted more than anyone, had turned into something terrifying and unrecognizable. I felt a wave of confusion crash over me. How could this be happening? What was wrong with Jeremy? Please, Jeremy, stop."
He bégayed, my voice breaking.
I looked into his eyes, searching for any sign of the friend I knew, but there was nothing there. Just a cold, empty gaze that chilled me to the bone. Tears streamed down my face as I struggled against him, feeling more helpless by the second. Then, with a sudden jerk, he dropped me to the ground. I landed hard, the breath knocked out of me. I scrambled to my feet, gasping for air, and backed away from him. He just stood there, watching me with that same unsettling smile. I didn't know what to do, my mind racing with fear and confusion. "Jeremy, what's wrong with you?" I whispered, my voice shaking. But he didn't answer. He just kept staring at me, his eyes boring into mine. I took another step back, my heart pounding in my chest. The friend I had known all my life was gone, replaced by something sinister and terrifying. I turned and ran back to the tent, my mind in a frenzy. I didn't know what to think or how to feel. All I knew was that Jeremy wasn't Jeremy anymore, and I was scared out of my mind. I lay in my sleeping bag, wide awake and trembling, listening for any sound that might indicate he was coming back. The night seemed to stretch on forever, and I couldn't shake the image of his twisted smile and cold eyes from my mind. The next morning, we woke up to chaos. Emily burst into our tent, her face pale and eyes wide with panic. "Mark's missing," she shouted, her voice trembling. Jeremy was still acting strange, but at that moment, my concern shifted to our missing friend. We all scrambled out of our tents, the fear from the previous night still fresh in my mind. We called out Mark's name, our voices echoing through the quiet campsite. There was no response. We searched the immediate area, hoping to find him wandering around or maybe taking an early morning walk. But there was no sign of him. The panic began to set in, and I could see the worry etched on everyone's faces. Jeremy's grandparents joined the search, their expressions grim. We combed through the woods, checking every possible hiding spot and calling his name until our throats were sore. But it was as if he had vanished into thin air. The fear that had gripped me last night now spread to everyone else. As we regrouped near the tents, Lisa came running over from Mark's tent, her face white as a sheet. "You guys need to see this," as she said, her voice barely above a whisper. We followed her to Mark's tent, dread settling over us like a heavy blanket. Inside the tent, we found Mark's belongings scattered around, as if he had left in a hurry. But what caught our attention was a piece of paper pinned to his sleeping bag. It was an old yellowed note with shaky handwriting that sent chills down my spine. It read, "And now it's your turn." The note made my blood run cold. I looked around at my friends, their faces reflecting the same fear and confusion I felt. "And what does this mean?" Emily whispered, clutching Jeremy's arm. He remained disturbingly silent, his eyes blank and distant. The realization that something sinister was happening hit us all at once. This wasn't just a prank or a simple disappearance. Something was targeting us, and Mark was the first victim. The sense of safety we had felt when we arrived at the campsite was completely shattered. We decided to stick together, not wanting to split up in case whatever took Mark came back. Jeremy's grandparents tried to stay calm, but I could see the fear in their eyes too. They told us to pack up our things, and we hurriedly did so, all the while keeping a watchful eye on the surrounding woods. As we packed, I couldn't help but notice Jeremy's eerie behavior. He wasn't helping, he just stood there, staring off into the distance with that same unsettling smile from the night before. I wanted to confront him, to shake him out of whatever trance he was in, but I was too scared to approach him. We gathered our belongings and decided to head back to the main road to get help. But before we left, Emily realized that Lisa was also missing. Panic surged through us again. We rushed to her tent, and sure enough, it was empty. The fear was now palpable, and our group was on the verge of hysteria. Inside Lisa's tent, we found another note, identical to the one in Mark's tent. "Now it's your turn." The words felt like a death sentence. The realization that we were being hunted sunk in deeply, and we knew we had to leave immediately. We hurriedly made our way through the woods, sticking close together and constantly looking over our shoulders. Jeremy's grandparents led the way, trying to maintain some semblance of order, but the fear was evident in every step we took. As we moved further from the campsite, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every rustle in the leaves, every snap of a twig, made my heart leap into my throat. The reality of our situation was sinking in. We were not safe, and something out there wanted us. The once exciting camping trip had turned into a nightmare, and all we could think about was getting out of those woods alive. We knew we had to stay vigilant and stick together if we had any chance of making it through the ordeal. The fear of the unknown and the sinister force targeting us drove us forward, our hope of escaping growing dimmer with each passing moment. As we hurriedly made our way through the woods, the fear in Jeremy's grandparents became more evident. They had always been a source of calm and wisdom, but now their faces were pale, and their hands trembled. Their eyes darted around nervously, as if they expected something to jump out at any moment. It was unsettling to see them like this, and it only added to our growing sense of dread. At one point, Jeremy's grandfather stopped abruptly, turning to face us with a grim expression. "We need to keep moving," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Whatever is out here, it's not going to stop until it gets what it wants." His words sent a shiver down my spine. What did he mean by that? What exactly were we dealing with? Jeremy's grandmother seemed equally frightened. She kept muttering to herself, glancing nervously at Jeremy, who was still acting strangely detached from everything. She caught my eye and gave a weak smile, but it was clear that she was just as scared as the rest of us. "We should have told you," she said softly. "There's something ancient in these woods, something that doesn't like intruders." Her words made my blood run cold. What could possibly be lurking in these woods that was so terrifying? I wanted to ask more questions, but the fear in her eyes stopped me. It was clear that whatever knowledge they had was too horrifying to share fully. We had to keep moving, but the weight of their fear hung heavily over us. The tension among our group was palpable. Emily clung to Jeremy, who remained disturbingly quiet and distant. Mark and Lisa were missing, and the rest of us were terrified we might be next. We tried to stay close together, every sound and shadow making us jump. The once beautiful woods now felt like a maze of nightmares, and we had no idea how to escape. As we continued, Jeremy's grandfather suddenly turned and looked directly at me. If we get separated, head for the old church on the other side of the woods, he said. It's a place of safety. His cryptic warning left me with more questions than answers. Why was the church a safe place? What exactly were we running from? Despite the fear, we pressed on, driven by the need to find safety. Jeremy's behavior grew more unnerving. He would occasionally stop and stare into the distance, a creepy smile playing on his lips. It was as if he was being pulled by some invisible force, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched through his eyes. The further we went, the darker the woods seemed to become. The sun barely penetrated the thick canopy above, casting long, eerie shadows all around us. Every rustle in the leaves, every snap of a twig, set our nerves on edge. The fear was almost tangible, a living, breathing entity that surrounded us. At one point, we heard a distant scream. It was faint, but it was enough to send us into a panic. Jeremy's grandmother grabbed my arm, her eyes wide with terror. We need to hurry," as she whispered urgently. "It's getting closer." Her words made my heart race even faster. What was getting closer? And why were we its target? The fear and confusion were overwhelming. We had started this trip expecting a fun adventure, but now we were running for our lives, pursued by something we couldn't understand. Jeremy's grandparents' fear was the most unsettling part of it all. If they, who knew these woods so well, were this scared, what chance did we have? As we neared the edge of the woods, I could see the outline of an old church in the distance. It looked weathered and abandoned, but it was the beacon of hope we desperately needed. We quickened our pace, every step bringing us closer to potential safety. But the fear still lingered, and the unanswered questions haunted our every move. Reaching the church, we hoped to find some sanctuary and answers. But even as we stepped inside, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was out there was far from finished with us. The terror we had experienced was just the beginning, and the true horror was yet to come. As we approached the old church, the air felt thick with tension. Jeremy, who had been eerily silent, suddenly stopped. He turned to face us, his eyes darker than before, a malevolent grin spreading across his face. "You can't escape," he said in that unnerving deep voice. "It's already too late." We froze, terror gripping us. Emily clung to him, tears streaming down her face. Jeremy, please," she begged, but he just laughed, a chilling sound that echoed through the trees. It was clear that whatever had taken hold of him wasn't letting go. Suddenly, Jeremy lunged at us, moving with unnatural speed. His hands reached out, aiming for Emily. Without thinking, I stepped between them, pushing him away with all my strength. "Run!" I shouted to the others. "Get to the church!" We scattered, each of us sprinting towards the safety of the church. Jeremy's grandparents led the way, shouting for us to hurry. Behind me, I could hear Jeremy's footsteps, getting closer and closer. My heart pounded, fear propelling me forward. We reached the church and slammed the door shut just as Jeremy crashed into it from the other side. The old wood groaned under the impact, but it held. Inside, we were all panting, trying to catch our breath. The sense of safety was fleeting, overshadowed by the terror outside. Jeremy pounded on the door, his voice distorted and filled with rage. "You can't hide forever," he shouted. We huddled together, the reality of our situation sinking in. This wasn't just a nightmare, it was real, and we were fighting for our lives. Jeremy's grandparents moved quickly, barricading the door with whatever they could find. "We need to hold out until morning," his grandfather said, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. "The daylight will weaken it." None of us questioned what he was, we just knew we had to survive. The night was a blur of terror and desperation. Jeremy's attacks on the door were relentless, each one sending splinters flying. Inside the church, we searched for anything that could help us defend ourselves. Emily found an old cross, clutching it like a lifeline, while I armed myself with a broken piece of wood. Hours seemed to stretch on forever. The sounds outside grew more frantic, and we knew Jeremy was getting stronger. But as the first light of dawn crept through the stained glass windows, the pounding on the door began to weaken. Finally, there was silence. We cautiously opened the door, peeking outside. Jeremy was gone, and the forest was eerily quiet. We stepped out into the morning light, exhausted and shaken. The church had protected us, but the experience had left its mark. As we made our way back to the main road, the reality of what had happened began to sink in. Mark and Lisa were still missing, and Jeremy, whatever had taken control of him, was nowhere to be found. The unanswered questions haunted us. What had possessed Jeremy? Where were our friends? And why had this happened? The aftermath of the experience was hard to shake. Even after returning home, the fear lingered. Nights were the hardest, filled with nightmares and the constant feeling of being watched. Jeremy's grandparents tried to explain the ancient curse that haunted the woods, but their words offered little comfort. Emily and I stayed in touch, supporting each other as we tried to move on. But the events of that week had changed us. We were no longer the carefree friends who had gone on a camping trip. We were survivors of something dark and inexplicable, bound by a shared trauma. Years later, the memory of that week still haunts me. The fear, the confusion, the unanswered questions, they're all still there, lingering in the back of my mind. I've learned to live with it, but I'll never forget the terror we faced in those woods. And every time I think of Jeremy's twisted smile, I'm reminded of the darkness that lurks just beyond the edge of understanding.